If I were to ask you to name a great Victorian engineer, there's a strong chance that the first name that would spring to mind would be Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And rightly so. In his 53 years on this earth, he was the driving force behind the Clifton Suspension Bridge, the Royal Albert Bridge, Bristol Docks, the Great Western Railway, the SS Great Britain, the SS Great Eastern, the SS Great Western, and many other projects. Today I'm going to look at his final work, a short branch line in West London, the Brentford Branch. The branch was begun by a company called the Brentford and Great Western Railway. This would connect with the Great Western Main Line at Southall. Then, as the name implies, run the 4 miles to Brentford. At Brentford there would be a brand new dock by the Thames. Although the line was theoretically independent, the trains would be run by the Great Western Railway. The GWR were more than happy to endorse the scheme because it would give them access to the Thames. In the mid-19th century, that was still an important cargo route. They'd been pushing for a line to Brentford since the 1840s. In fact, one journalist stated that the possession of Brentford is as vital to the Great Western Railway as Sebastopol is to the Allies. Which was a little melodramatic, but that's the Victorians for you. Getting authorisation wasn't easy. The London and South Western Railway, the GWR's arch-enemies, had a line through Brentford, and they weren't keen on sharing. Even more worried were the Grand Junction Canal. The new railway would enable goods to be transported from Paddington to Brentford, which was also one of the canal routes. Parliamentary authorisation for the railway was granted, but not without some strict clauses giving the affected parties some say over the engineering and the route taken. Brunel was the engineer in charge. Having experience in both major railways and major dock complexes, this should have been a walk in the park for him. However, this was a time when he was spreading himself rather thin with his workload. Among other things, this was when the SS Great Eastern was undergoing its nightmarish construction process. Perhaps it was stress that caused him to dramatically underestimate the cost of the Brentford branch. As a result of this unanticipated cost, the railway ended up being leased to the GWR. The line opened on the 15th of July 1859, just 2 months before Brunel passed away following a stroke. He had been suffering from ill health for quite some time, no doubt exacerbated by his extreme workaholic tendencies. Nevertheless, the Brentford branch and its dock were as well engineered as any of his more prestigious projects. The branch was laid to the broad gauge of 7 feet and 1/4 inch, Brunel's favoured track gauge, which never really caught on. I found this section of track nearby, and I did wonder if it might be a remnant, but on measuring it, it's 4 inches too wide. I believe it would have been built for a crane instead. At first, the line was single track, but in 1861 it was doubled. Oddly enough, the second track was laid to the standard gauge of 4 feet 8½ inches. In 1875, after it had become clear that there was no real future in broad gauge, the first line was relayed to standard gauge. Initially there were 3 stations: Southall, Brentford Town, and Brentford Dock. However, due to safety concerns, passenger services didn't run over the branch until 1860. There were also ideas to extend to a riverside station to meet a ferry to Kew, and even to cross the river and run all the way to Twickenham. A combination of cost and opposition from the London and South Western Railway meant that neither of these came to pass. Passenger trains terminated at Brentford Town, Brentford Dock station being built for excursion traffic. Not a whole lot is known about the dock station, including how much it was used and where exactly it was. Historians think it was probably about here on Justin Close. Undoubtedly the most famous feature of the branch is the intersection of road, rail and canal that's officially known as Windmill Bridge, but more commonly known as the Three Bridges. Here, the road passes over the canal, which passes over the railway. Brunel had to design an aqueduct to carry the canal, and there was a lot of pressure. One of the clauses the Grand Junction Canal had insisted on was that the railway should pay £10 for every hour the canal was out of use. That's the thick end of 900 quid today. The main purpose of the line was freight, and it was a great success in that regard. Passenger traffic was always a bit of a disappointment, never justifying more than a couple of coaches. The line had been largely rural when it was built, and one of the big problems was simple geometry. The junction with the GWR main line faced away from London, so it wasn't possible to run trains all the way from Brentford to Paddington without stopping. I dare say that came as something of a relief to the canal. In 1904, a fourth station was opened at Trumpers Crossing, known as Trumpers Crossing Halt. The GWR tended to spell halt with an E, having borrowed the concept from French tramways. I am planning a video on this whole subject in the future, by the way. The station theoretically served Hanwell, but in practice, not really. The station took its name from the Trumper family, who owned the nearby Warren Farm and, ironically, had been opposed to the construction of the line. Halts were a concept the Great Western Railway pioneered as a means of competing with trams using steam rail motors, single units with an engine built into the coach. But in 1906, trams came to Hanwell, and in 1926 the GWR gave up the fight and closed Trumpers Crossing. In 1930, a goods yard was opened, because goods traffic just kept growing. Factories were springing up along the Great West Road, and the railway was perfectly positioned to help them out. The new goods yard even had access to the canal, which is perhaps ironic given the canal's previous opposition. But while the line thrived in other respects, the passengers just weren't there. The service was gradually reduced, and in 1942, passenger trains along the branch were withdrawn. The stations, apart from the goods one, closed. Other than that, the future of the line looked rosy. Well, until the 1960s. What did for the line was the same thing that did for the rest of London's docks: containerisation. Brentford Dock was unsuitable for handling containers and totally incapable of handling large container ships. Road haulage was increasingly overtaking rail as the preferred means of shipping goods, but the docks had poor road access. After a dockside crane collapsed in 1964, the powers that be decided that things probably weren't going to get any better. On the 31st of December that year, the docks officially closed. Since then, redevelopment has obliterated most of the old buildings. As for the railway, with no dock to serve, no passengers to carry, and few customers choosing to send their loads by rail, it went into seemingly terminal decline. In 1970, the goods yard closed. Eventually, the Greater London Council came up with a solution to justify the line, which was a load of rubbish. Or rather, a consistent load of rubbish 4 times a week. The goods yard was sold and turned into a waste transfer yard, where household rubbish from the boroughs of Richmond, Hounslow and Ealing could be loaded on trains and taken off to landfill. It's not much compared to the line's heyday. The track south of the transfer station has been lifted, and there are only a few fragments of the old line. The track is overgrown, and you'll be lucky to even see a train on an average day. I'm sure it's not what Brunel envisaged, but it does at least serve an important purpose. It certainly didn't go to waste. Good evening, I do hope you enjoyed this video. If so, I would be grateful if you would leave a like and perhaps subscribe for more. I've always been curious about the Brentford branch, so it was interesting to have the opportunity to explore it. With increasing environmental concerns, I do wonder about how viable landfill trains will be in the long run, but for now, things are looking at least okay for the line. Thanks as ever to my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon. You are the aqueduct to my canal. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.